Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding in Mishnah Berurah Chelik Vav. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Rosh Hashanah. We've been learning the very interesting halachos of Shofar. And we pick up today on Daf Nun Ches Amud Beis. Hopefully we'll do Nun Ches Amud Beis and at least some of Nun Tes Amud Aleph. So we will be on today's page in the Dirshu schedule. But we pick up on Nun Ches Amud Beis and the second line in the Mechaber in Sif Dalet. Says the Mechaber, Shofar shall tikroivus avodas kechavim. If you have a shofar that came from an animal that was actually used to serve avodah zarah. Let's take a look right away at the Mishnah Berurah is cutting you a test. Pirush behema shehikrivuha lekarban lifnei avodah zarah. This behema was actually slaughtered. It was offered as a sacrifice to avodah zarah. Va'asu mikarneha shofar. And then they took the horn of this animal and fashioned a shofar from it. So says the Mishnah Berurah, shofar shall tikroivus avodas kechavim. If you have such a shofar, afilu haya shall ovid kechavim, even if this belonged to a non-Jew, shetaka bay, and now you went and blew shofar with it for the tekiyah shal mitzvah, la yatza. You cannot be yatza mishum de'ena betela ilamis, because the halacha is that if an animal was actually sacrificed as a carbon to avodah zarah, that type of avodah zarah object can never become nullified. It can never become batel. You can never remove the status of avodah zarah from that object. If you remember, we learned previously in Siv Gimel, we learned that there's a difference between a shofar that's the avodah zarah of a yid or if it's the avodah zarah of a non-Jew. If it's the avodah zarah of a yid, then the Mechaber told us there's no way to ever be mevatel it. If she'ena betela olamis, there's no way to be mevatel an avodah zarah object that belongs to a yid. But when it comes to an avodah zarah object that belongs to a non-Jew, it can become batel. The non-Jew could be mevatel it. He could declare it to no longer be avodah zarah, and then it removes the avodah zarah status from the object. But when it comes to an animal that was actually sacrificed to avodah zarah, over there, even if it belongs to a non-Jew, there's no way for it to become batel. And we learned previously in Sif Gimel, when you have an avodah zarah object where the status of avodah zarah cannot be removed from it, if the halacha is that it's eina betela olamis, then you cannot use it for the mitzvah of shofar because it's ketuse mechtas shiure. Since this object is an object of avodah zarah, it is destined to be burned. Its only possible destiny is for it to be burned or to be thrown into the Yam HaMelach. And therefore, it's oimid l'sreifa, it's awaiting destruction, and in halacha we look at it as if it's already been destroyed. So we don't see, halacha doesn't see a shofar here. Halacha sees a pile of ashes. And a pile of ashes does not have the minimum size requirement to be used as a shofar. And therefore, this shofar is, in its essence, puzzle. It doesn't have the minimum shear. That's the explanation of this sif. Says the Mishnah Berurah, nice cut and chaf, mishum de'ena betela. Since this is a shofar of an animal that was actually sacrificed to avodah zarah, it could never become batel, and therefore it's as if its minimum shear requirement is chopped up. That's what ketuse mechtas means. It's chopped up, it's ground up, it's ashes, and it doesn't have the minimum shear. The chanal, and like we saw previously in Sif Gimel. Now we go to Sif Hey. Again, a very, very interesting sif we have over here. Hamudar hana mishofar. If somebody made a neder where he said he's not going to derive any hana, any pleasure, any benefit from a shofar. So, like we always explain, the format of a neder is when somebody looks at a chayfetz, he looks at an object, and he says, that object should be to me as something which is forbidden. So, for example, he looks at the shofar and he says, kainam shofar ze alai. Kainam is another way of saying carbon. That shofar should be to me like a carbon. Now, a carbon is aser bahana. If you designate an animal as a carbon, as a sacrifice, you're not allowed to derive any benefit, any pleasure from that animal. It's a carbon animal. So when you look at a shofar and you say kainam shofar ze alai, you're asering the chayfetz. You're prohibiting that object on yourself as if it was a carbon. So now you can't derive any benefit from that object. So therefore, says the Mechaber, very interesting. Hamudar hana me shofar. If somebody makes such a neder, but the format of the neder is he prohibits himself to derive any benefit from that shofar as if it was a carbon. Let's see right away. The Mishnah Berurah is cut in Chaf Aleph. Hamudar hana mi shofar. He made a neder which prohibits it prohibits himself from deriving any hana from the shofar. It says the Chavetz Chaim, Kegoin, for example, Sha'amar, he said, Kainam hanas shofar alai. The benefit of that shofar is to me like a carbon. That's what he said. What's the halacha? Says the Mechaber, Adam acher toikea boy. Somebody else can pick up that shofar, blow the shofar, and this person who made the neder can be yotzeh the mitzvah of shofar by listening to the sounds of that shofar. However, he himself should not blow the shofar for himself. So again, he made a neder and he prohibited himself from deriving any hana from that shofar. What's the halacha, says the Mechaber? If somebody else picks up the shofar and blows it, this person could be yotzeh the mitzvah of shmias kol shofar. He could be yotzeh the mitzvah of listening to the sounds of the shofar. However, he himself should not pick up the shofar and blow the shofar for himself to be yotzeh the mitzvah. Why is this? Let's take a look in the Mishnah Berurah. Explains the Mishnah Berurah in Ois Katan Chav Beis. Adam acher ritzaynoi loymar. What the Mechaber wants to say over here is, explains the Chavetz Chaim, af al gav de'ein yochol lahafkia atzmai mitzvah shofar bishvil neder zeh. Even though he cannot remove himself, eino yochol lahafkia atzmai, he cannot remove himself mitzvah shofar, from the mitzvah of shofar, bishvil neder zeh, as a result of this neder that he made. What does the Chavetz Chaim mean? This neder does not render him exempt from the mitzvah of shofar. Why? Because what's the neder that he made? He made a neder that the hana, the benefit of that shofar, is prohibited to me. Now, listening to the sound of the shofar, to be mekayim the mitzvah of shofar, let's remember what we learned. That's not considered a hana. Why? Because mitzvahs lav lehanais nitnu. We don't look at being mekayim a mitzvah, fulfilling a mitzvah, as a hana, as a pleasure, as a benefit. Mitzvahs lav lehanais nitnu. When the Rabbeinu Shalom gave you a tzivui, he gave you a mitzvah, he told you to listen to the shofar, that's not for you to get a hana. You're being mekayim the gzeres hamelech. You're fulfilling the Ratzon HaBoreh. You're fulfilling the command that the Rabbeinu Shalom gave you. That's not a hana that you're getting. It's something that you need to do. It's something that you're required to do. But that's not considered a hana. So really, mitzvah lav lehanais nitnu. So because you made a neder prohibiting the benefit of the shofar, you're still allowed to be mekayim the mitzvah from that shofar, because mitzvah lav lehanais nitnu. That's the first thing that the Chavetz Chaim points out over here. The mitzvah loy mikri hana, the chanal, because the fulfillment of a mitzvah is not called a hana, like we learned previously. Mitzvah lav lehanais nitnu. Mikal makayim, nevertheless, the Mechaber is telling you, Yishma tikya shofar me acher. You should hear the blowing of that shofar from somebody else. V'lo yiska ba'atzmai. You yourself, or the person who made the neder himself, he should not blow the shofar for himself. Why? V'atam, and the reason for this, kasra paiskim, the paiskim write that the reason is, Mishum diyesh harbe b'nei adam, because there are many people, and Shlomo Zalman, if you're listening, you'll understand this, and I know we discussed this on the phone, sheyesh lehem hana kishehem toikin. There are many people, and I can tell you this again for myself, from my own experience as a Baal Tekeya, when you blow the shofar, and it comes out well, you enjoy it, you feel it. You know, it's you blew that shofar, and it worked perfectly, and it was a beautiful koil. You feel a pleasure. You feel a hana. So that's separate from the fact that you were mekayim the mitzvah. It's not the hana of, Baruch Hashem, I feel so good, I was mekayim the mitzvah of shofar. That hana is not a problem. Mitzvah's lav lehanais nitnu. That is what's the word I want to use? That is subjugated. That is tuffle to the fact that you were Mekayim Gzeres HaMelech. Mitzvah Slavli Hanos Nitnu. But there's simply a physical pleasure. I feel good that I blew the shofar and it made a good clean sound, and that makes me feel good. That hana is considered a hana. V'hana saguf leka l'shruye b'shvil time of the mitzvah slavli hanos nitnu. So the Chavetz Chaim is telling you is like this. The Mechaber is splitting hairs. The Mechaber is differentiating between two different hanas. This person went ahead and he made a neder that he's not going to derive any benefit from that shofar. So he asered the shofar on himself that he will not derive any pleasure from the shofar. Well, the mitzvah, the hana that comes from being mekayim, the mitzvah of shofar, that's not problematic, because mitzvah slavli hanos nitnu. Even though you'll say the person has pleasure from the knowledge that he was mekayim, the mitzvah of the Rabbeinu Shalom, it doesn't matter. Mitzvah slavli hanos nitnu, you have to go be mekayim gzeres hamelech. Whatever hana, spiritual hana you get from that is not considered a hana in the context of Hilchos Nedarim. So that's not a problem. So if somebody else picks up that shofar and blows it, and you listen to the tekiyas, and you're mekayim the mitzvah, that's fine. That you're allowed to do. But for you yourself to pick up the shofar and blow in order to be mekayim the mitzvah, that is problematic. Simply because you may get a physical enjoyment from the sound of the shofar, and that would be a problematic hana, and that's why the Mechaber says somebody else could blow for you, but you should not blow it. Continues the Chavetz Chaim, right by the Ois Lamed Ches for the Sharet Zion. Umikam Mokem, nevertheless, Kasva Achrayim, the Achrayim right, the B'shas Atchak, if it's a pressing situation, She'ein Lo Yacher, that you don't have anybody else to blow the shofar for you. So you went ahead, for whatever crazy reason, you went ahead and made this neder, and now you're stuck there on Rosh Hashanah, you're in quarantine. I was in quarantine last Rosh Hashanah. Somebody's in quarantine, and he has the shofar sitting there on the table, and this is the shofar that he made a neder. He will not derive any hana from that shofar, and there's nobody else to blow it for him. So in the Shas Atchak, the Chavetz Chaim says, Mutter loy ba'atzmai l'skaya. In the Shas Atchak, if he's stuck, he is allowed to pick it up and blow it for himself. Rak, however, she'ein loy l'skaya ki em asar kolos. However, he should only blow the minimum amount of kolos that it takes to be mekayim the mitzvah, which the Chavetz Chaim says is 10 kolos, which is one complete set. The Hainu tekiya shvarim trua tekiya, that's 4 kolos. Tekiya shvarim tekiya, that's another 3 to make 7. Tekiya trua tekiya, which makes 10. Shehei me ikar adin, that's what you need me ikar adin to be yotze the mitzvah. So don't blow anything extra. Blow one set of kolos in order to be mekayim the mitzvah. That you could do in a Shas Atchak, because after all, not everybody really gets a hana from blowing the shofar and hearing a good sound. It's only a chash. So therefore, you have a mitzvah say daraisa to hear shofar. We're not going to tell you to be mevatel mitzvah say daraisa because of your silly neder. But you should only blow what's necessary. Meikar adin, don't blow anything extra. Now, the fact that the Chavetz Chaim says over here that all you need is 10 kolos, we're going to have to analyze that a little bit deeper, Mirz Hashem, when we get to Siman Taf Kuf Tzadik. Does the Chavetz Chaim really mean over here only 10, or does he mean 30? Does he mean 3 sets of 10? It seems from the Chavetz Chaim over here, he says pretty straight, only 10 kolos. The Kaf HaChaim writes that Chavetz Chaim can't mean that. He must mean 3 times 10, but we'll analyze that a little bit deeper, Mirz Hashem, when we get to Siman Taf Kuf Tzadik. But this is a beautiful piece of lamdus over here, and we're going to go further into it now. So this discussion so far was germane to the person who made a neder where he prohibited the hana of the shofar on himself. So if we go back to the Chavetz Chaim in Ois Katan Chav Aleph, the Chavetz Chaim told us that what this person said was kainam hanas shofar alai. The hana, the benefit of that shofar, should be usher to me like a carbon. That's the neder that this person made, and therefore he could be yotze the mitzvah, because mitzvah slavli hanos nitnu, so he could listen to somebody else's blowing, but he himself should not blow it because of the physical pleasure he may derive from blowing. And the Chavetz Chaim says, b'shas atchak, if he's stuck, he could even blow it himself. Now let's continue with the Mechaber with another case. Now says the Mechaber on the bottom line, Aval im Omar. However, if the person makes a slightly different neder, what if the neder he makes is kainam litiki osai alai? Now what the person says is, I'm prohibiting the shofar for its blowing. What's the difference? In the first case of the Mechaber, what the person said was, I'm prohibiting the benefit, the hana of the shofar on myself. Now, he didn't say he's prohibiting the benefit of the shofar. He specifically said he's prohibiting the blowing of that shofar on himself. And let's take a look at the beginning of Chavetz Chaim Ois Katan Chav Gimel, where the Chavetz Chaim points out the difference between this case and the first case. Says the Chavetz Chaim, Shaloi Hizker Hanoah. In this second case, he didn't say what the Chavetz Chaim said in Ois Katan Chav Aleph. In Ois Katan Chav Aleph, in describing the first case of the Mechaber, the Chavetz Chaim said, the person said, Kainam Hanas Shofar Olai. The hana, the benefit of the shofar, is prohibited to me. But that's not what he said here. Says the Chavetz Chaim in Chav Gimel, Shaloi Hizker Hana. Over here, the person didn't mention hana. He didn't prohibit the hana of the shofar. Or Ritzayne Loimar, and what the Mechaber means to say in the second case is, Sha'amar, that the person making the neder said, Kainam ha-shofar, the shofar is to me like a carbon, litiki osai alai, in the context of its blowing. So he specifically mentioned that he's prohibiting the blowing of the shofar. The act of blowing on this shofar should be to me like a carbon. Oh, in that case, there's going to be a problem. Now that we understand what the person who made the neder actually said, let's see what the Mechaber says. Avalim Amar Kainam Litikiyasai Alai, says the Mechaber on the bottom line. If the person who made the neder said that the act of blowing of this shofar should be prohibited to me like a carbon, so he didn't answer the benefit, he answered the act of blowing, then asur liskayabai afilu tikiya shel mitzvah. Then he cannot even have somebody else blow the shofar for him to be yotze the mitzvah. Now he cannot be yotze the mitzvah from this shofar at all. Let's see the Mishnah Berurah again. Ois Katan Chav Gimel. So kainam l'tikiyasai alai. If the person who made the neder did not prohibit the hana of the shofar, or it's on a loimar, what the Mechaber means to say is sha'amar kainam ha-shofar l'tikiyasai alai, that what he said was, I'm prohibiting on myself the act of blowing. The blowing of this shofar should be prohibited to me like a carbon. Val karcha chayil, that neder is chal. Kevan shepiresh lesar al atzmai ha-shofar liskoya boy. He's not prohibiting any benefit of the shofar. If he went ahead, like the Mechaber's first case, and he prohibited benefit from the shofar, so then we could use the argument of mitzvah slav lehanais nitnu, and we could say, you could be yotze the mitzvah from that shofar, because that does not constitute a hana. But over here, the person didn't aser hana. He asered the blowing of the shofar. And if somebody else blows the shofar, that is blowing of this shofar. And you asered the blowing of this shofar on yourself like a carbon. It has nothing to do with hana. And that neder is going to be chal, and you're going to be stuck. Kemai, this is similar to, says the Chavetz Chaim, she'oiser al atzmai hatzror lizraik boy. Somebody goes and looks at a pile of stones, a pile of gravel, and he says, I am asering the throwing of this gravel on myself. So, there's no hana in the throwing of the gravel. Just picking up the gravel and throwing it. There's no hana involved in that. But he's still not allowed to pick up the gravel and throw it, because he didn't aser hana of the gravel. If you tell me he aser hana from the gravel, and there's absolutely no hana involved in throwing the gravel, so maybe he would be allowed to throw the gravel. But over here, he didn't aser the hana of the gravel, he asered the act of throwing the gravel. So whether it involves hana or it does not involve hana, it's still aser. So too over here in this case with the shofar. He didn't aser hana of the shofar. when you just go to Asr Hana from the shofar, you could say mitzvah slavli hanais nitnu. But that's not what this person did. He answered blowing of the shofar. Any blowing of this shofar is answered to me. So okay, doesn't matter mitzvah slavli hanais nitnu. The bottom line is, if you listen to somebody else blow that shofar, that is blowing of the shofar. You answered on yourself anything that has to do with the blowing of this shofar. So it's kal. And this is not the Chavetz Chaim's own distinction. He takes this from the Ran in Masechtas Nedarim. Avalim Amar Stam Kainam Shofar Alai, if he would have just said, this shofar should be to me like a carbon. So he also didn't mention Hana, but he didn't mention the tekiah, the blowing of the shofar either. He just said a very vague lashon. He said, this shofar should be to me like a carbon, then mutar l'skaya by tekiah shal mitzvah. That would be akin to the first case. Then we would allow him to hear the blowing of that shofar, because we would assume the default would be that he meant to answer the hana of the shofar. That's the default. If somebody says that shofar should be to me like a carbon, the default is he means that the same way a carbon is aser bahana, the shofar is aser bahana. Mitzvah slavli hanis nitnu, so somebody else could blow the shofar and you could be yaitz the mitzvah. But over here, the guy mentioned specifically, I'm answering the tekiah, the blowing of the shofar. So now I can't even listen to somebody else blow the shofar. The Chavetz Chaim explains this further in Eis Kotnchav Dalet. Also l'skaya, va'afilu piresh benidroi tekiah shal mitzvah. Even if the person said in his neder, I'm answering on myself the blowing of this shofar for the purposes of mitzvah. So you might say, oh, maybe the neder can't be chal. Maybe a neder can't be chal on a mitzvah. No, that's true. Not true. It's not true. A neder can be chal on a mitzvah. V'atam the nedarim iser chetzehu v'chal afilu al dvar mitzvah. We had this distinction earlier in Hilchos Tainis also. We have to remember about a neder is that a neder can even override your chiyuv of a mitzvah. Why? Because what are the mechanics? What's the lumdus of a neder? The lumdus of a neder is you're not prohibiting yourself to do something. That's the difference between a neder and a shvuah. Let's say somebody makes a shvuah. He swears that he will not listen to the koil of a shofar. His shvuah is not chal. He's allowed to listen to the koil of shofar in order to be mekayim the mitzvah. Why? Because you can't make a shvuah that obviates you from being mekayim a mitzvah, because you are mushba v'oimid mar har Sinai to do the mitzvah. By Har Sinai, you accepted upon yourself a shvuah to fulfill the mitzvah. So now you're going to make a shvuah that you're not going to fulfill the mitzvah? You can't do that. It's too late. You already have a shvuah that requires you to be mekayim the mitzvah. So a shvuah cannot be chal on a dvar mitzvah, but a neder can be chal on a dvar mitzvah. What's the difference? The difference is that the mechanics of a shvuah are you're trying to prohibit yourself from doing something. You cannot prohibit yourself from being mekayim mitzvah, because you already have a chiyuv to be mekayim the mitzvah. But that's not the mechanics of a neder. The mechanics of a neder are you're mushba v'oimid from Har Sinai to hear the sounds of a shofar. Now you went ahead and you looked at a shofar and you said, that shofar is prohibited to me. Okay, so it's very nice that you have a chiyuv to hear the sounds of a shofar, but you don't have a shofar. What do you mean I don't have a shofar? There's a shofar sitting on a table. Oh, no. That shofar is not available to you because you asered that shofar like a carbon. So that shofar is not available to you. So yeah, it's very nice that you have a chiyuv to be mekayim the mitzvah, but you have no way to be mekayim it. It's as if you didn't have a shofar, or you had a puzzle of shofar. You have a shofar of a behemoth tameya sitting in front of you. Okay, you can't be mekayim the mitzvah. It's a shofar of a behemoth tameya. You have a shofar that's less than the share of a tefach. So you don't have a kosher of shofar. You can't be mekayim the mitzvah. So too over here. Yes, you have a chiyuv to be mekayim the mitzvah of shofar, but you don't have a shofar. What do you mean? There's a shofar right over there. That shofar is also to me. So you're placing a prohibition on the chayfetz, on the object, not on yourself. And that's why a neder could be chal on a dvar mitzvah. And that's why the Chavetz Chaim said here, Va'afilu pirish benidroi tekiah shal mitzvah. Even if the person making the neder specified that he's answering the shofar on himself in the context of tekiah shal mitzvah, it's still chal. Va'atam, the reason is the nedarim iser chefzahu, because a neder places a prohibition on the object, not on you yourself. The chal afilu al dvar mitzvah, and that's why it takes effect even in the face of a mitzvah. You can't even hear somebody else blow that shofar because you answered that shofar on yourself in the context of its blowing. Continues the Chavetz Chaim, V'da, however you should know, that there are poskim who want to say, and again he brings this from the Ran, she'ein chala neder, that this neder does not take effect, ela im kain asar ha-shofar alav, only if you specifically prohibited the shofar on yourself. Kegoin, for example, sha'omar, that the one who's making the neder said, shofar alai b'kainam liskayabai. This shofar is forbidden to me like a carbon in the context of its blowing. But you mentioned specifically the shofar. Aval, ba'asar alav ha-tekiah, but if you didn't mention the shofar, instead you only mentioned the blowing of the shofar. Kigoin, sha'amar tikiyas shofar alai b'koinum. The blowing of the shofar should be ushered to me like a carbon. Ein oichal. Then the neder does not take place. Why? Because what is the chayfetz that you tried to prohibit? You didn't try to prohibit the physical shofar. You tried to prohibit the blowing of the shofar. So the Ran says you can't do that. Ta'atekiah ein by mamish. The blowing is not a tangible object. It's an inanimate, intangible object. The blowing. Unedarim ein chalan adavar shein mamish. And a neder could only take effect on a physical object. It can't take place on an intangible object like blowing. So the distinction that the Ran wants to make over here is the first case of the mechaber was when somebody answered the benefit of the shofar on himself. The second case of the mechaber, the way we explained it until now, is somebody answered on himself, in the words of the Chavetz Chaim, Kainam ha-shofar litkiyasai alai. This shofar is ushered to me in the context of its blowing. Now the Ran is splitting hairs a little bit further. He's saying there's two ways you could say that. In one way, you mentioned the shofar itself. So you said, shofar alai b'kainam, this shofar is to me like a carbon, liskayabai, in the context of its blowing. In that case, you mentioned the physical object. But then there's a case where a person does not mention the physical object so much. What he does is, he says himself, Tikiyas shofar alai kikainum. Only, not the shofar is usher to me in the context of its blowing. No, the blowing of the shofar is usher to me like a carbon. The blowing is not a tangible object. So the Ran says that the neder can't be chal on that. However, says the Chavetz Chaim, Kama paiskim sovereign shechal af bazeh. Many paiskim hold that the neder would be chal even if you said it that way. He brings this down from Taisis and the Arzaruah, the Kolbai, and Rabbi Yerucham, others. They say that no, either way the neder is chal, because in both of these cases you did at least mention the physical object. One way you said the shofar is usher onto me in the context of its blowing. In the other way you said the blowing of this shofar is usher to me. But in both cases you did mention the physical object, and therefore the neder would be chal. And stamad demilsa kavanasa lesar chayfetz alav. Either way, these Rishonim say clearly your intent was to put a prohibition on the object. Now says the Chavetz Chaim, v'chol zeh, this whole discussion of exactly how you said it, that if it's chal or not, is only le'inyan iser Torah. It's only germane to the question of whether or not an iser neder is going to be chal on the shofar min HaTorah. Aval midrabanan, but as far as isurei derabanan, iki isura b'chol gavnei. Either way, there would be an issa drabanan of neder on the shofar. Afilu b'neder shein by mamish. Even if you didn't mention the shofar at all, and you only tried to answer on yourself the blowing of the shofar, which is intangible. Kamavur b'yardei siman reish yud gimel. And therefore, also l'skaya by kaidem shiyater neder. It would be also for you to blow this shofar or to hear the blowing of this shofar until you are matur neder. All of this only applies to a neder, like I explained previously. Aval b'shvua, if we would be dealing with a shvua, you cannot remove yourself from the mitzvah of hearing a shofar through a shvua. Because your shvua not to be mekayim the mitzvah of shofar cannot take place in the face of your shvua at Har Sinai to be mekayim the mitzvah of shofar. Unless there's a caveat to that halacha. And we mentioned this previously as well. There's a concept of an iser kailul. So before we read it inside, let me just explain to you what this means. Like I said, you cannot use a shvua to remove yourself from the chiyuv to be mekayim a mitzvah. Why? Because you're mushba v'omed Har Sinai. You already took a shvua at Har Sinai to be mekayim the mitzvah. So now to go ahead and make a shvua not to be mekayim the mitzvah, your new shvua cannot take effect in face of the shvua that you made at Har Sinai. However, there's an exception to that rule, and that's what's called an iser kailul. In an iser kailul, you're making a shvua that incorporates many different aspects of the shvua that you're making, many different manifestations. So in our example over here, let's say a person makes a shvua that I will not hear tekiyos shel mitzvah. I will not hear, I'm making a shvua not to hear the kolos of shofar to be mekayim the mitzvah. That shvua cannot be chal, because that is a shvua which is isolated, it's targeted specifically to the mitzvah. And a shvua to not to be mekayim a mitzvah can't be chal, because you're mushba v'omed b'Har Sinai. But let's say you make the shvua a little bit differently. Let's say the shvua that you make is, I will not listen to any sounds that emanate from a shofar. Oh, so now your shofar also includes, if the Baal Tekeh wants to be cute, and a week before Rosh Hashanah he wants to show off his skills at shofar, and he picks up a shofar and he plays Yankee Doodle Dandy on a shofar. So he picks up the shofar, he starts playing music on the shofar. Your shvua was targeted at that as well, because you said, I'm making a shvua, I'm not going to listen to any sounds of a shofar. And there's no reason why your shvua cannot be chal on that. There's no mitzvah for you there's no mitzvah that requires you to hear Yankee Doodle on a shofar. So your shvua can be chal on that. Oh, since your shvua could be chal on that, it's also going to be chal on the kolos that you need to hear for the mitzvah. So that's an iser kailul. If you make a shvua that incorporates all sorts of different things, and your shvua can be chal on a lot of other manifestations of your shvua, then it will also be chal on the mitzvah. So says the Mishnah Berurah here. The Mishnah Berurah says, your shvua not to listen to a shofar, to be mekayim the mitzvah, can't be chal, because you're mushba v'omed Har Sinai, unless your shvua incorporates other sounds of the shofar as well. Damashma afilu b'tekiyah shel rishus. If the way you made your shvua was that you incorporated in your shvua even optional sounds of the shvua, ubazeh chal shvuasai b'kailel, then your shvua will be chal as an iser kailel. It will incorporate everything. Lesar gam b'shel mitzvah. It will include also the kailos that you need for the mitzvah. V'yishtadel lahatir shvuasai, and then you have to go ahead and try to go to a chacham and be matir your shvua so that you should be able to be mekayim the mitzvah. Va'afilu gabi nedarim, even when it comes to a neder, im asar atzmai l'shmaya shofar b'ploini. So let's say you made a shofar, you made a neder, Let's say you made one of the nedarim that we said is going to take effect and is going to prevent you from listening to a shofar. So you went ahead and you made a neder asering the blowing of this shofar on yourself. So, okay, You didn't answer the hana, you answered the act of blowing on this shofar. So we said that neder will be chal, and you can't even listen to somebody else blow that shofar. So now, says the Mishnah Berurah, realize that only limits you to hearing the blowing of that shofar. But you can listen to somebody else blow a different shofar. So okay, so walk 5 miles to the next shul and go ahead and hear shofar from somebody else. So eine nifka mi mitzvah tkiyah shofar, you're not potter for the mitzvah of tkiyah shofar. V'tzarich levakesh ish acher l'shmayim mimenu shofar. You have to find somebody else to blow a different shofar for you. V'im lo yimtza acher, and if you can't find somebody else, also l'shmayim ish zeh, you can't listen to the shofar of this person. Afilu also atzmai b'shvua she'eno kinishba levatel as mitzvah. I lost my train of thought over here. 1 second. So v'im lo yimtza acher also l'shmayim ish zeh afilu also atzmai b'shvua. Oh, what the Chavetz Chaim is saying now is you have to realize that even if somebody made a shvua, let's say he made a shvua as an Isser Kailul, right? We said that also takes effect. If somebody made a shvua, I will not listen to any sounds that come out of this shofar. So all right, again, you're not mafkiah yourself from the mitzvah of shofar. It's true, you can't listen to that person blow the shofar because your shvua was chal because of the Isser Kailul. But still, it's not a shvua. Your shvua was chal because it's not a shvua to be mevatel the mitzvah of shofar. Shebeshosha yasa shvua mipiv lo hoysel levatel. That's not a shvua to be mevatel you from listening to the shofar. Sharei eina mitzvah l'shmar meish zeh dafka. What the Chavetz Chaim is saying here is a little bit different. Forget what I just said about the Isser Kailul. What the Chavetz Chaim is saying over here is slightly different. Let's say somebody made a shvua and he said, I'm making a shvua, I will not listen to the kailos of shofar for the mitzvah from this shofar. So you might say, oh, the Chavetz Chaim told me that a shvua is not chal because you're mushba v'oimin mahar Sinai. Says the Chavetz Chaim here, not so fast. That shvua does not run counter to your shvua at Har Sinai. Your shvua at Har Sinai was to be mekayim the mitzvah of shofar. But you don't need to hear shofar from this person with that shofar. So if you make a shvua, I'm making a shvua, I will not listen to Rabbi Ploini blow his shofar to be mekayim the mitzvah of shofar. That's not going keneged your shvua at Har Sinai. Your shvua at Har Sinai did not require you to hear Rabbi Weiss blow his shofar. Your shvua at Har Sinai required you to hear a Baal Tekeah blow a shofar. So maybe your shvua not to hear shofar blowing from Rabbi Weiss is chal. Just you have to go to a different shul and you have to hear from somebody else. And that's what the Chavetz Chaim means here. He says that shvua could be chal because it doesn't run counter to your shvua from Har Sinai, and therefore you have to be mishtadel, you have to work to go hear somebody else blow shofar. Okay, fascinating Hilchos Nedarim over here that comes in the middle of Hilchos Shofar. Let's do Siv Vav because it's very small and there's only a few words of Mishnah Berurah on it. Siv Vav, top line of Nun Tes Amud Aleph. Hayakoloi av ma'od. If you have a shofar that has a very deep sound, oidak ma'od, or it has a very high-pitched, very fine sound, kosher. Either way, the shofar is kosher. Shakala kolos ksherim b'shofar. Whatever the sound of that shofar is, it's kosher. There's no requirement of a certain pitch or a certain tone. No, whatever sound the shofar makes is a kosher sound. Says the Mishnah Berurah Katan Chafei dak ma'od v'hu adin im hayot tzarud v'yavesh. The same thing is true if the sound of the shofar is sort of hoarse. If it's dry and raspy, that's also a koil. Don't look at it and say that's not a koil. It's staticky. It's a chopped up koil. No, I'm not. If it has breaks in it, it's going to start to become a trua or a shvarim or something. But if it's a continuous koil, just it's raspy, it might not be the most pleasant to listen to. But that's also a kosher koil. Indeed, what's interesting over here is the poskim. It's a little bit of a machlekes poskim, but I think the consensus amongst the poskim is even if the koil changes in the midst of a koil. So let's say you're blowing a tekiah. I should stop bringing my shofar here so I can demonstrate and show you what I mean. If the tone of the shofar changes mid-coil, so it's like doo or doo, according to most poskim, that would seem to be a kosher coil. That's the coil that came out of the shofar. If that's the coil that came out of the shofar, that's a kosher coil. But we'll go into that a little more in depth as we continue. Okay, thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. The discuss of limud HaTorah should be making against Klal Yisrael. The Rebbeinu should send Yeshua's refuahs and parnasa to all those in need, and we should be zeicher to see the Bias Gal Tzedek b'meher v'yameinu. And we shouldn't have any more tsaras, especially in light of the terrible tzara that Klal Yisrael experienced on Lag BaOmer. We should only hear besurais, tovais, Yeshuais, v'nechamais. Be well.